What goes through your mind when you see and hear that German tanks are once again rolling through the Donbass?
I don't think there can be any kind of mixed answer here, except to say that it's truly terrifying to see and deeply painful to watch. I was born back in the Soviet Union, and I was always raised to believe that the worst thing that can ever happen to any country, to any people, is war. That's the most terrible thing imaginable. And of course, I never could have imagined that it would actually happen again and that I would live to see it.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom.
Welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. This was not a war like any other. The attack by Hitler's dictatorship on the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945 was a particularly brutal war of extermination.
1941 bis 1945 war ein besonders grausamer Vernichtungskrieg. Dies lässt sich daran ermessen, dass viele Historiker.
You can see this from the fact that many historians at the German Military History Research Office quit their jobs early because they just couldn't bear the horror that came at them from those documents anymore. Anyone who wants to understand what kind of war that was can come here to Volgograd, to the Museum of the Battle of Stalingrad. And that's why today I'm speaking with the museum's head of research and press director.
Schlacht von Stalingrad in Volgograd. Здравствуйте, Irina Alexandrovna.
Hello, Irina Alexandrovna. Hello. Thank you very much for your time. My Russian isn't very good, so there will be a translation.
As the head of research at this museum, which welcomes more than 1 million visitors each year, how do you see your mission here?
The mission of our museum, the Stalingrad Battle State Memorial Museum, is to preserve the memory of the events of World War II and the Battle of Stalingrad. This is essential to make sure such terrible events never happen again, anywhere in the world. From the very beginning, the museum was created to keep that memory alive and pass it on to future generations.
What do visitors get to see here that they won't find anywhere else?
Our museum holds a great number of personal belongings from those who fought in the Battle of Stalingrad. There were even stories of soldiers who, before going off to war, wrote home from the front saying, "If I don't make it back, come to Stalingrad. There will definitely be a museum there, and you'll see my photograph, you'll see my things." And very often, people who didn't even know what had happened to their relatives, those who were missing in action, for example, would come here, visit our city, and find out the truth. A soldier might have been buried in a mass grave on Mamayev Kurgan. We also have a special department that works on decoding names. They keep a detailed card index for that purpose. For many years, people who didn't know where their loved ones were buried would come here and finally find out. And that memory, it gained a real, tangible place. A place where you could come, bow your head, and honor the memory of a relative, a father, a grandfather, or a great-grandfather who gave his life for the motherland. At Mamayev Kurgan, in the memorial hall, the names of those who died defending Stalingrad, defending their country, are also inscribed. And for people who suddenly find the name of one of their relatives there, it's deeply meaningful and a great honor to know that their loved one is remembered here. That we remember our heroes, that we preserve this memory, and that we pass it on to future generations.
You said something interesting before we started. You said politicians make decisions about wars, and it's the people, the population, who end up suffering. And that's something you can really see here in the exhibition, in all the individual stories that are documented, Like, for example, the story of the soldier Ponomarenko.
Des Soldaten Ponomarenko.
Yes, of course, it's a tragedy. Any war is a tragedy. Any war brings destruction and death. Mothers lose their sons, wives lose their husbands, children lose their parents. And of course, the reason the topic of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad, is so important for people, for our entire nation, is because it literally touched every family. Almost every family had someone who fought on the front lines. And even though that history is fading with time, as more and more years pass, it's still there. Through one generation, through two generations. Those were our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers. It's still very close to us. There are things that have truly been preserved, stories that can still be told to very young children, even those who've just been born. That's very important because if we forget, if we let that memory fade, the danger is that wars will happen again and again. And people will keep killing each other. No idea is worth the loss of human life. That's why it's so important to remember what a great tragedy this is, and how crucial it is not to let it happen again. I'd like to ask you about a few individual stories. We already talked about the soldier Ponomarenko, who wrote his report in his passport with his own blood. There's a rather interesting exhibit in the Panorama Museum, the passport of Dr. Ponomarenko. He was a resident of Stalingrad who, during the Battle of Stalingrad, became a military doctor and provided medical help to wounded soldiers. At the same time, he himself was seriously wounded. He wanted to leave a final message because he was absolutely sure those were his last moments, that he wouldn't survive such a terrible injury. But in that moment, he didn't have any paper on hand except his own documents, his passport, and no ink except his own blood, flowing from a serious wound. So he wrote in his passport, in his own blood, that he didn't want to die at 26, that he wanted to live, that he still wanted to do so much for his country and for the people. He left that passport hidden between the bricks of the Gerhardt Mill, which you can still see today, the building next to the Panorama Museum. Fortunately, even Ponomarenko survived. After the war, he returned to Stalingrad, found the hiding place by the signs only he knew, and retrieved his passport. Later, as a kind of relic, a testament to the fierce battles and the selflessness of the Soviet defenders of Stalingrad, he donated it to our museum.
Then, during the tour of the large panoramic exhibition, we also learned about other personal stories through her. For example, the story of the sniper Zaitsev.
Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev was one of the most famous snipers of that time. He fought on the Stalingrad front as part of the 62nd Army. The key feature of the battles in Stalingrad was, above all, street fighting, a situation where Soviet and Nazi positions were extremely close to each other, sometimes separated by just a few dozen yards. In those brutal urban battles, sniper fire became a very effective weapon and tactic. Around 1,000 Soviet snipers operated on the Stalingrad front, and together they accounted for roughly 27,000 enemy soldiers. Zaitsev was among the most renowned of them. He developed new sniper techniques and trained young soldiers, serving as a kind of mentor and teacher of sniper warfare. For his heroism in the Battle of Stalingrad, he was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. His sniper rifle is also preserved in the museum. He donated it there after the war.
What really defined the fighting in Stalingrad, as you mentioned earlier, was the house-to-house combat. Some buildings were captured, then recaptured, and taken again. There were battles between the second and third floors, even between the third and fourth. Hand grenades were flying back and forth. But the Red Army managed to hold the crucial riverbank. How did that happen?
By the way, it was Vasily Zaitsev who came up with the phrase that became a kind of motto for all the defenders of Stalingrad. When he first arrived there, they noticed his marksmanship, handed him a sniper rifle, and asked if he understood his mission. He replied, "Yes, beyond the Volga there's no land for us." That phrase, that beyond the Volga there's no land for us, that the enemy must be stopped right here, captured the spirit of the time. The enemy could not be allowed to reach the Volga, because the river was vitally important. It was the main transport artery used to move military supplies and deliver the oil needed to keep the war effort going. And everyone basically understood that. It's not that there was any doubt, but people knew, yes, this is the critical point. Yes, the country is huge, there's still a lot of territory, but we can't let the enemy move any further. He has to be stopped. Moscow is, of course, extremely important. It's the capital. But Stalingrad is just as vital. It's a major transportation hub, a major industrial center. And finally, the city bears Stalin's name. Losing a city named after Stalin would have been a moral defeat. That's why people here truly fought to the death. They understood that the enemy had to be stopped at any cost.
The battles for Stalingrad were also a war against the civilian population. People were hanged, shot, and deported.
Yes, a very large number of civilians suffered. The thing is, events unfolded extremely fast, and there was basically no time to organize an evacuation of the civilian population before the battle began. Of course, some people were evacuated, but still a huge number of civilians had to stay in the city. When the bombing started on August 23rd, the bombs destroyed the oil storage tanks on the Volga River, and as a result, the river itself caught fire. After that, it was no longer possible to cross the river. And on the other side, everything was already taken by the fascists. So many people died trying to cross through that burning water, but many others chose to stay in the city, facing that terrible danger, and tried somehow to survive. They hid in basements, in dugouts, sometimes just in holes they dug into the ground, trying to survive in those harsh conditions. But they didn't just hide. They worked in factories too, doing their part for the victory. Even children and teenagers tried to help the army. They often became scouts since they knew the layout of the streets and the buildings so well. They helped however they could. And of course, a huge number of people lived in the areas that were occupied. More than 80% of the city was under fascist control. From those occupied districts, civilians were taken away to concentration camps in Germany and other European countries under Nazi occupation.
What's also interesting is that the big tractor factory kept producing tanks even while it was under fire during the fighting. And 40% of all Russian T-34 tanks came from the Stalingrad tractor plant.
Yes, as long as it was possible, until the fighting actually reached the factory workshops. The plant kept operating and kept producing. During the war, instead of tractors, it started making tanks. And quite often, even the factory workers themselves took part in the fighting. There are documented cases describing how a worker, after repairing a tank, would climb into it, drive out, and join the battle. So even when it was no longer possible to produce new tanks, the plant still kept working on repairs.
The German commander here, Field Marshal Paulus, was promoted to Field Marshal by dictator Adolf Hitler because the Führer believed that a German field marshal would never surrender. But the surrender did happen, and 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. What role did that play in the course of the Great War?
First of all, it was the first time in German history that a field marshal was taken prisoner. Paulus became the first field marshal ever to surrender. And Paulus really was a major, very important figure in the Nazi army. He was one of the authors of Operation Barbarossa, the plan for a lightning war against the Soviet Union. And as we know, once he was in captivity, he became actively involved in anti-fascist work. He spoke to German officers, urging them to stop this senseless war, to surrender, and to bring the fighting to an end. And when the Nuremberg trials took place, as we know, he testified as a witness for the prosecution, meaning he spoke on behalf of the Soviet Union. That, of course, came as a complete surprise and caused real shock among the other German military leaders. After all, Hitler's right-hand man was now testifying against them. Even after spending a long time in captivity, Stalin still didn't allow him to return home for quite a while. It was only after Stalin's death that Paulus finally received permission to go back to his homeland. And as he was leaving the Soviet Union, he said his famous words, "I came to this country as an enemy, but I leave it as a friend."
But the fighting in Stalingrad was also the real turning point in the combat operations of the Second World War.
Without a doubt, the Battle of Stalingrad marked the beginning of a major turning point in World War II. In fact, Stalingrad became the farthest point east that the fascist forces were able to reach. They didn't advance any further. It was there that they were finally stopped. And from Stalingrad began the Red Army's liberation campaign moving westward. It was after Stalingrad that we saw the Battle of Kursk, the breaking of the siege of Leningrad, the liberation of occupied territories in Belarus, and later, the liberation of other European countries that had been captured.
Dazu zählt natürlich auch die Befreiung.
That, of course, also includes the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. A young journalist from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Stefan Locke, wrote an entire page to mark the anniversary of Auschwitz's liberation, but he forgot to mention that it was the Red Army that liberated the camp. What do you make of that?
Dass die Rote Armee Auschwitz befreit hat. Was halten Sie davon?
Of course, it's very painful to see how historical facts are sometimes being distorted today. And this can't just be explained by propaganda. These are facts. Why does the museum exist in the first place? Because it holds real documents, real materials that don't allow for any double interpretation of historical events. That's why it's so important. Coming back to the mission of our museum, we preserve documents. We preserve materials that clearly show how, unfortunately, some people and even some governments in certain countries are now trying to deny these facts for their own interests. And naturally, that can only cause deep pain.
Am 9. Mai wird hier auch in Volgograd.
On May 9th, people here in Volgograd also celebrate the victory over the Hitler dictatorship and Germany's liberation from fascism. The whole city is out and about. I see school classes staying at our hotel. Young people are wearing the St. George ribbon and caps that recall the service of the Red Army. Would you say that the fight against the Hitler dictatorship and the victory in World War II have become part of the national identity?
Der nationalen Identität geworden ist.
Absolutely. And it's part of the cultural code, you could say, of the entire country, of the whole Russian people. Because, as I've said before, there was hardly a single family that wasn't touched by the war. And of course, it's a holiday for everyone. As the old Soviet song said, it's a celebration with tears in your eyes. Yes, it's a holiday paid for with enormous blood at a very high price. But still, it's a holiday. It's a celebration of freedom. And it's a celebration of freedom not only for our country, because the whole world was liberated. The threat was immense, hanging over the entire world, and it was our people who freed the world from the danger of fascism. So, of course, when we recognize this great and deeply important mission, this truly significant victory, even generations who know it only from textbooks still feel themselves part of this vital cultural code and national pride.
In den russischen Familien, so habe ich das erlebt.
In Russian families, at least from what I've seen, the grandparents pass on their experiences of the war much more strongly to their grandchildren. But today, both in Germany and in Russia, we're dealing with people in their 20s and 30s who have no real idea what war actually means. How do you handle that? What can you do to help convey that experience?
Was können Sie leisten, dies zu vermitteln?
When we walked through the museum, you probably noticed how many of our visitors are young, children, teenagers, lots of organized groups. Whole school classes come here, and many travel from other cities. And of course, they want to learn more about all this. That's really one of our main goals, to share this memory, this history, with the younger generation. And not just through abstract lectures, but through real, tangible things. Even when you climb Mamayev Kurgan, the memorial was built there for a reason. That's the actual site of the battles. This is where blood was shed. This is where Soviet soldiers fought, many of them not much older than the boys and girls who climb that hill today. Everything embodied in those sculptures, so vivid, so full of emotion. I think it's no exaggeration to say that no one leaves unmoved after visiting this place and hearing these stories.
In contrast, I do see a lot of historical amnesia among younger people in Germany. There's a saying that goes, "Those who know nothing have to believe a lot." Do you think that's a danger for how things are developing today?
Ist das eine Gefahr für die Entwicklung heute?
That's a very accurate expression, and I completely agree with it. In our country, there's also a well-known saying that a people who don't remember their past have no future. And I think that really is the main mission of everyone who works with history. Those who preserve historical materials, and the guides who share these stories with children. We actually do a lot of work with the younger generation. Not long ago, we even opened a children's museum center. It has staff who design programs specifically for kids. These programs come in different formats: modern, multimedia, even in the form of quests or fun interactive activities. So we try to speak to young people in a way that's clear and engaging, while still teaching them about important events and historical facts.
I'd like to ask you, Irina Alexandrovna, not as a historian, but as a person, what goes through your mind when you see and hear that German tanks are once again rolling through the Donbass?
I don't think there can be any mixed answer here, except to say that it's truly terrifying to see and deeply painful to watch. I was born back in the Soviet Union, and I was always raised to believe that the worst thing that can ever happen to any country, to any people, is war. War is the most terrible thing there is. And of course, I never could have imagined that it would actually happen again, and that I would live to see it.
I can feel your pain, and I don't think it gets any easier when we talk about the politicians in Germany who are now making statements like, "Russia will always be our enemy," or "We're at war with Russia." Do you sometimes get the impression that there's a new generation of politicians who want to take revenge for the defeat at Stalingrad?
Of course, I'm not a politician or a diplomat, and it's hard for me to make such broad conclusions. But I'm deeply convinced that, especially in today's world, humanity has to move forward. Waging war by physically destroying other people is, to put it simply, an outdated way of doing things. People should strive for progress, including intellectual and mental growth, and find more civilized ways to resolve any kind of political conflict or situation.
каких бы то ни было политических конфликтов и ситуаций.
Würden Sie der
Would you agree with the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, who once said, and I'm paraphrasing here,
ich zitiere dem
"We Russians have forgiven, but the Germans have forgotten"?
verziehen, die Deutschen haben vergessen?
Мне сложно сказать, насколько
It's hard for me to say whether the word forgive is really appropriate here, but one thing is absolutely clear, and you can see it yourself. The memory of that war has not been forgotten. Again, many of those who lived through the war, and this isn't just my personal opinion or speculation, these are the memories of real people, civilians who experienced it firsthand. They recall that when columns of prisoners were marched through Stalingrad, Russian women would often bring them food, sharing even the little they had at the time. They no longer felt hatred toward them, but rather pity for people who had simply ended up in that situation. Because, as we've already said, wars are started by politicians, but it's ordinary people who bear the consequences. And many of those drawn into war are, in fact, just hostages of circumstance. They're sent to fight, they follow orders, but do they really want to be there? I think far from always.
Думаю, что далеко не всегда это так.
Wenn Sie heute
When you see that in Germany today, there's once again agitation against Russia,
gegen
that there's a return of hatred toward Russians and Russophobia. Would you say that's a form of racism?
Würden Sie sagen, das ist eine Form des Rassismus?
Опять же, как показывают уроки истории.
Once again, as the lessons of history show, especially the history of World War II, racism, Nazism, and any similar ideology are destructive. They bring nothing but devastation and suffering.
Она приносит только уничтожение и беды.
Wir haben viele Jahrzehnte
We've had many decades of reconciliation between the people of Russia and the people of Germany.
hinter uns.
I think that was historically unique,
Nach dem
especially after the War of Annihilation in World War II.
auch historisch
And now we're seeing a new ice age, a new confrontation.
erleben wir eine neue
Do you think reconciliation is possible again?
Glauben Sie, dass Versöhnung wieder möglich ist?
Конечно, очень хочется верить, что все-таки...
Of course, I really want to believe that humanity will overcome this crisis, that common sense will prevail, that truth will prevail, that people will finally turn towards some kind of peaceful ideas and realize that this is still our shared world, our shared history. If you think about it on a global scale, a human life is such a short moment in the history of the universe and even of our planet. We're all so deeply connected that dividing people by any criteria, especially by nationality or race, is a dead-end path. We're all inhabitants of this planet, and will keep living together one way or another. But the quality of that life, whether we destroy this world and each other's worlds, or whether we create and make them better and richer, depends only on us. And I want to believe that this understanding will, in the end, win out.
Вот понимание все же победит.
Haben Sie ein Wort für die
Do you have a message for the politicians in Germany who are once again talking about being ready for war, and for the people who are letting themselves be drawn into new wars?
Kriege hineintreiben lassen in Deutschland?
Наша страна, русские люди, жители...
Our country, the Russian people, the citizens of Russia, do not want war. Yes, there was a war, but we were defending our homeland. Our country doesn't start wars unless it's to protect itself. And of course, we're part of the wider world, part of a shared culture. I think the most important thing is to understand that and to preserve this common world of ours. Thank you very much, Irina Alexandrovna. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Irina Alexandrovna,
Спасибо.
die Forschungsleiterin
The head of research at the Museum of the Battle of Stalingrad here in Volgograd says we must not forget the historical legacy of this war. Politicians start wars, people suffer because of them, and she hopes for a new phase of reconciliation.
neue Phase der Versöhnung. Spasibo
Thank you very much for your time.
Ja. Wir bei Gegen den Strom
Here at Against the Current,
zeigen Ihnen
we show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden.
Medien verschweigen.